I had the pleasure of conducting some focus groups with 3 lots of farmers. Did a national focus group with livestock and dairy farmers. We did a mixed farming focus group with people from North East Scotland, and a crop and horticultural focus group with people in Fife. And the aim of that was to say, have they experienced water scarcity, what effect does it have, and what can they do about it? So I think the first thing was that everybody felt their area and their sector had been affected by water scarcity, even though at the time we'd had one of the wettest winters and springs on record. So I think one of the key things was that farmers need to be prepared for the extremes, and they need to respond, be resilient to both too much and too little water. They're really keen to talk about that mixture. And about 80% of them felt their individual businesses were already being impacted by water scarcity. So they saw it as an issue. But unfortunately, less than half had a contingency plan. So that's the first take home, that actually farmers need to plan for this. It's part of their everyday risk management. Farmers use a mixture of surface water and groundwater, and sometimes it comes through the tap from Scottish Water or from their own private water supply, and sometimes directly from a burn, a loch or a borehole. And everybody knew where their water came from. But most of them didn't know how much water they were using or how much water they needed for their business. That's quite an important issue. And what we found was that everyone knew they had a right to use water, but they didn't always know the responsibilities that came with it. And not everyone knew how it was regulated. So the key thing is that if they use up to 10 metres cubed a day, then it's general binding rules. They don't need to tell anyone, they just need to use water wisely, and they need to keep their equipment in good repair. Then if it's up to 50 metres cubed per day, that's normally for more intensive livestock and very small scale horticultural cropping, then they need to register with SEPA. And lastly, if they use more than 50 metres cubed a day, then they have to get a licence from SEPA, and SEPA officers can tell you what the restrictions are there. So that was the first thing that people kind of wanted to know more about that. And then when it came to licences, some of the issues people were picking up were that they couldn't share their licence allocation. So they might not use it all, and their neighbour might really need it, but they weren't able to trade it. So that's one of the things they brought up with licences. But I think the key thing for most of our focus groups was just actually they needed a bit more awareness of what they were entitled to and what the responsibilities came with it. So one of the things in terms of why it affects business is that we found from the literature and the focus groups that first of all it can decrease yield. It can also reduce quality, and that can be really important, like in the barley sector, the difference between malting and feedstock barley, it's a big difference in profit. It can be very variable and therefore hard to plan and get into contracts. And if you have livestock, you might need to buy and feed, and that's often more expensive at times of water scarcity, or even destock if you can't get enough feed. So everyone can go on the website and look at SEPA's water situation reports, and that shows for your local area how the main river is looking, and from that you can use your local knowledge. Farmers know their land, and whether you think you need to start taking steps and preparing yourself. The other issue is SEPA recommend local water abstraction groups. We didn't find any evidence of farmers using them in our focus groups, but actually getting together and working out how best you can manage collectively the water in your area is a really good idea. And a lot of areas have catchment management groups or fisheries groups who are really keen to help farmers work in this area. So farmers don't have to necessarily do this themselves, they can reach out to one of those groups to help them. So the first thing that any farmer can do is look after their soil, which most farmers do anyway. But actually, if you have lots of soil organic matter and you have good drainage, then that helps the soil hold water at times of scarcity, and it can also help the water permeate the surface into the groundwater rather than running off and causing floods. So another way of thinking about that is what we call natural water retention measures. This might be allowing boggy grounds to stay boggy, or putting in like an earth furrow or a leaky dam that just traps the water in winter and kind of gets it to infiltrate rather than running off. So those are things that farmers can do. The next set of measures is thinking about managing land and maybe some slightly more macro scale decisions. So some farmers in our focus groups had changed their grazing regimes, had gone to mob grazing, or they'd extensified their herds because they were having issues with grazing and feed. Also thinking about minimum tillage techniques to try and keep water in the soil, particularly at dry and hot times. So things like going to automatic waterings, which actually use water very efficiently but keep your stock well watered in times of water scarcity. So things like that, sort of technical issues that you can do to really improve the efficiency of your water use. And if you're an irrigated farming systems business, then actually trickle irrigation is much more water efficient than spray guns or rain guns. And they, according to the literature, pay themselves back in about 6 years in terms of reduced labour and fuel costs. But of course, most farmers will only do this if they're renewing their infrastructure, because it's quite a big capital outlay, but it is an option. Then we talked quite a lot, but I have to say people weren't so positive about these issues, about rainwater tanks and also creating artificial lagoons. So these are really good for capturing water when you've got too much rain and then using it as your irrigation source in the summer when you not have enough. But there were questions about rainwater tanks, about whether the water would be fit to use for washing and livestock. So sometimes you have to do additional processing to make sure it's clean. And with the lagoons, they're quite expensive and they might create more fuel use to pump the water from the lagoon to where it's needed rather than sticking your pipe in the river right next to the field. There were some options to have payments through agri-environment climate schemes, but the schemes were seen as a little restrictive and the amount of money maybe not quite enough to give them a good return on investment. So these are options, and increasingly the US and Australia, in England, they are using them more and more, but in Scotland farmers weren't so convinced that it was a good option right now. But I think this is the kind of thing people will look to more and more in the future. One thing we considered when we were looking at the literature from other countries is that in other countries they have like farm water calculators to allow farmers to estimate how much water they need and therefore whether it's worth investing in these technologies. At the moment we don't really have good data on water use by anything other than license abstractors, but if we could get more data, then that's something that might be great to create an online tool just for farmers to estimate their exposure to water scarcity. Another adaptation that farmers are keen to see, but actually requires research scientists and agronomists to do the work, is looking at different species of grass for more resilient grassland to droughts, but also other crop varietals, vegetable, barley, that kind of thing, because increasingly farmers understand that they're going to have varietals that can respond to too much water and too little, so there's work that could be done there. So one of the things that also came up in our focus groups is thinking about timing of your planting and of your crops and where you put it on your farm. So actually bringing resilience to flooding and water scarcity into your farm plan is a really good idea. Your farm advisor can help you with that.